Hello friends, welcome to A Gentle Healing Journey. My name is Rain. On this channel, I talk about subjects of healing and struggles and challenges. And as I work through my psychology education, I want to share some of those tidbits of my learning with you, all in an effort to maybe get you thinking about things in a different way, in a new perspective. My cat is right beside me here and he's asleep, so you might be hearing some snoring noises. He's such a good boy. Today I'm talking about grief, and I'll also talk about anticipatory grief. I decided that I wanted to talk about this because I actually felt a little uncomfortable recently with the fact that I feel great. For those of you who don't know, my husband passed away last May from suicide, and the last 5 years that we were together were extremely difficult. I told him I wanted to separate for a while just to see if that would help the relationship. He eventually agreed, but he didn't really agree because he took his life a few months later. When you go through a loss, you will go through grief. The loss doesn't have to be the death of your spouse or a family member or a good friend or even a pet. The loss could be a fire that destroys your home. It could be identity theft where someone steals all of your savings. That actually happened to me. It could be losing your job or losing a friendship. Loss can also happen on a primal level. I remember when I had my very first apartment. Oh my gosh, I was so young. When I came home from work one day, my front door was open and all of my stuff was gone. I'd been robbed and I suddenly felt very scared and unsafe. So not only was I grieving the loss of my possessions, I was also grieving the loss of my sense of safety. There is so much loss that we experience in life, and most people go through grief and they don't even know what they're kind of going through because it's a time of dizzying emotions and chaos and so much uncertainty. Now, the 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. They're not linear. You don't go through them in order, like checking one off and then moving on to the next stage. You can actually go through all of the stages of grief in less than a minute. And I'll give you a personal example. After my husband died, I was in a lot of despair and I needed help. I went to see a therapist and I was talking to her about the stages of grief. And I asked her, how does this work? I've gone through grief before, of course, especially when I've lost my beloved pets. But finding my late husband after he died was extremely traumatic for me. And I knew that it was going to affect my life in a very profound way. So I wanted to kind of be proactive about the healing process. I honestly didn't want to dwell in grief and trauma. My life otherwise, and I mean besides the broken relationship, was actually starting to flourish. I was studying, I was doing a lot of good work. I was part of a beautiful online community where I participated in live streams. I was doing projects around the house. I was thriving. So I wanted to do whatever work was necessary to come out on the other side to a place of flourishment again. So I felt like my life had been kind of forced into a big involuntary stop, and I didn't want it to stop because, like I said, besides the relationship, things were really, really going well for me at that time. Another reason why I wanted to work efficiently through the grief is because I'm well aware of how time flies. I know my age, and I've come to a mindset in the last year or so that I don't want to waste any more of my time on whatever doesn't serve me or help me to thrive and to shine. I had a work-related burnout in the 2000s, and it took 11 years for me to feel better. Not to heal, to feel better. I still have symptoms and side effects that will never go away, but I've learned to manage them. But in hindsight, I felt like I was robbed of a decade of my life, and I didn't want that to happen again. That's another example of loss, by the way, that I felt like 11 years of my life were wasted on burnout, depression, and anxiety. I had to grieve the loss of those years. My entire 30s just gone, forgotten from burnout. I think I'm over it, though talking about it, it does kind of create a little bit of regret, but that's for another day. Anyway, back to the therapist. I had a vague idea what the stages of grief were, but I really wanted to learn more. And about, I don't know, 5 minutes after speaking to her about how I was feeling, she said to me, you know, Rain, you just went through all of the stages of grief multiple times in the last 5 minutes. And she started to explain these stages to me. So this is kind of like what I was saying to her. In a nutshell, I was saying this. You know, I'm so angry at him for putting me in the position of having to find him there, and that he didn't even leave me any kind of goodbye note. I'm in a place where I still don't believe it. I don't believe it happened. It's like, okay, he's not there anymore. And part of me wants to believe that maybe he just moved out. And sometimes I find myself actually saying, oh, he just moved out. Then I kind of get a reality check and I know he's dead and I feel so guilty, and I say, if only I had given it one more chance, if only I'd been more forgiving, you know? And I just feel so horrible that I don't even want to get out of bed. The only reason I get out of bed is to take care of the dogs, but I know he's not coming back. And I know he made that decision to relieve his own pain. So what can I do but try to work through it and accept it? That's what I said to her. So if we break this down to the 5 stages, the first stage is denial. That was me saying, oh, he just moved out. It was to try to convince myself that what happened didn't happen. I think the shock was so alarming that denial was a defense mechanism so that the reality of finding him there didn't kind of break my brain or something like that. Second is anger. I said I was angry at him. I was angry at spirit. I was angry at myself. I started to blame myself. There were plenty of things that made me angry as the months passed, that's for sure. Third stage, bargaining. That was me thinking that if only I'd been more forgiving, given it another chance, maybe he'd still be alive. Bargaining was kind of me wishing for a different outcome. So by doing this, I was focusing my thoughts away from his death, so it kind of shielded me, but temporarily, from the reality of the situation. 4 is depression. Me mentioning that I didn't even want to get out of bed. I was so sad. I lost interest in all of my favorite things. I had 0 attention span. I just wanted to escape, and I did so by drinking a lot for a few months last summer, unfortunately. So then there's acceptance. The last thing I said to her was that I know he's not coming back, and what can I do? I accepted it. So you see how it's not linear. It can be like a roller coaster as you go through the feelings and the emotions. I spent a lot of months on anger. In fact, that was the stage that lasted the longest for me. But I'll do a separate video on each of these stages and how I personally went through them after his death. But at this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is when you start grieving the loss of someone before they're gone, or grieving the loss of something before it happens. I'm sure we've all been in a situation, say, at work, when we feel like something's not quite right. There's whispers about layoffs, and we feel like we're next on the chopping block, right? We can experience anticipatory grief and start to grieve the loss of our job before we even get laid off. And another example of anticipatory grief that I've felt happens when I watch my pets age. When the dogs start to show signs of old age and slowing down, I start to grieve their loss because I know it's inevitable that I'll have to say goodbye to them. To my cats too. And I think, you know, in the case of my late husband, I was going through anticipatory grief for years. I wasn't grieving his imminent death because I didn't quite know that he would go through with it, but grieving the imminent end of our marriage. I mentioned earlier that the last 5 years together were very difficult. We tried so many things, but the problems were not couple related. The problems stemmed from abuse and his unwillingness to get help for his untreated mental health challenges. And I've said this before in another video. I'm not trying to paint him as a monster because I didn't fall in love with a monster. He had troubles. And a lot of the times, unfortunately, he took those out on me. You know, as the relationship continued, a downward spiral, it really set in, and I realized that nothing was going to work. And I know I went through those 5 stages of grief until February of 2025, just over a year ago, when I asked him for a separation. I'd reached acceptance of my anticipatory grief last year. I got the idea to do this video because of an encounter that I had with someone I knew recently. This person was well aware that my husband had passed away, and when I bumped into this person while I was in town, and they asked me, "How are you doing?" They noticed the new do, the short blonde hair, and mentioned that I looked very different, but it didn't seem like a compliment. I responded honestly, and I said, "You know what? I'm doing great. I feel happy," and that I was moving on in a healthy way. I mentioned that. And that person's response was a surprised look on their face like that with, "Oh my gosh, if it were me, I'd be grieving for years." It felt so uncomfortable. I tried not to take this personally, but it felt a bit like a judgment that I wasn't appropriately upset. We have to understand, my friends, that everybody grieves in their own time. But it also had me thinking that maybe I was in denial because I truly felt happy. I felt free and independent. But should I have been feeling that well? Was it too soon? There was a little bit of guilt that popped up after that encounter. But as I reflected on this, I realized that my grieving period after his death, it may have been shorter than most people's, right? Because I'd been grieving the end of the relationship for years already. There is a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She first mentioned the stages of grief in her book on death and dying. And I recently started to read another one of her books on grief and grieving. And it was in this book that I got the idea about anticipatory grief. She's passed away, but she said in this book that she knew she was dying. And she said she had anticipatory grief about it. So after reading this, I applied this to myself, and I realized that yes, that's exactly the perfect way to describe what I'd gone through. And the foreword was actually written by Maria Shriver, and she talks about her own struggles through loss, and she says something really, really interesting. She says, "We are a grief-illiterate nation, and Dr. Kubler-Ross, through her work, gave us permission to grieve." I loved reading this because it reminded me of that encounter with that person who seemed to be judging my shorter grief period. A grief-illiterate nation. Well said, Maria. People should have the right to grieve the way they see fit, for as long or as short as they need to grieve. Grief is a part of everyone's life, even animals. I remember reading a book ages ago called When Elephants Weep. Oh, it was so good. It talked about how animals feel emotions and grieve their losses just like we do. So no creature on this earth is immune to grief. It's all part of life. And learning about the stages of grief really helped me go through them in a way that was more efficient so that I could work through the loss in a more healthy way, where I finally found peace of mind and acceptance. It all starts with education. We have to understand what we're going through and what we're going to be going through, and understand that there's no set time frame or method. It's all very, very personal. So I guess my message is just to have faith in yourself. If you've experienced a loss or you're grieving that loss, learn all you can about grief and the 5 stages of grief. Understanding what you're going through is very, very helpful and healing. And please, don't compare yourself to how long other people grieve for their losses. You might be the type of person who stays in grief for years, who walks away from society and community, and that's okay. That's absolutely okay. You may be someone who can work through it quickly, And of course, that's okay too. Or maybe you're like me. You've had anticipatory grief for the impending loss for years. That's absolutely okay. So my friends, I hope that by sharing this with you, you might take something positive from it. Thank you so much for watching. Be well, and I'll see you next time. Bye.